Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
From a very young age, Paige learned that dreaming about love was a luxury for people who already had the basics. Her childhood was full of absences, absence of food, of stability, of any sense of peace. She remembered staring at an empty fridge and pretending she wasn't hungry so her mom wouldn't worry. She grew up hearing broken promises, neighbors knocking on the door demanding money, and the sound of her mother counting loose change at the end of each day to see if they could afford even the bare minimum. And through all those hard times, one phrase kept repeating like a mantra: marry a man with money who can take care of you. Love doesn't pay the bills. It was almost like a survival anthem in their home. Paige didn't know exactly what love was, but she understood fear very well, the fear of being cold, of going hungry, of ending up just like her mother. So from her first relationships, she always judged potential partners through that lens. If someone had plans, a stable job, or a career on the rise, she'd get interested. If they were too dreamy, aimless, or unstable, she'd pull away. Choosing security wasn't about vanity or ambition, it felt more like a survival instinct. She watched her friends fall for musicians, artists, freelancers, people living gig to gig. And every single one ended up coming back home drowning in debt and disappointment. Paige swore it would be different for her. She wanted a life where bills got paid before they were due, where she could open the fridge and see it full, where she'd never again have to hide her panic behind a smile. At 29, she met Miles. He was an engineer, organized, disciplined. Not the type to write poems or send flowers for no reason. But he had a steady presence, knew exactly what he wanted, spoke clearly, and always kept his word. When Paige met him, she felt a deep sense of relief. Finally, it seemed like life was falling into place. He had a solid job, his own apartment, and a future plan that included family, scheduled vacations, and financial stability. When he proposed, she said yes, completely certain it was the right decision. It was as if her mother had guided that choice all along. The first few months felt calm. Miles was predictable, but that was comforting. They made grocery lists together, set up budget spreadsheets, planned annual goals. Bills were never late. The car got replaced right on schedule. The house was quiet, clean, functional. No fights, no surprises. It was exactly what she thought she wanted. But as time went by, something inside her began to shift. What once felt like safety now started to feel like suffocating routine. The days blurred together, conversations circled around the same topics: investments, home maintenance, deadlines, responsibilities. There was no room for the unexpected. No surprises. No sparks. Paige slowly became aware of a discomfort she struggled to name. She started showing up late to plans with Miles on purpose, pretending to forget simple tasks just to see if he'd react differently. But Miles stayed completely unchanged. He assumed everything was fine because, to him, if things were organized, then everything was okay. She tried bringing up lighter topics, sharing stories from work, talking about feelings, but Miles responded with practical advice. "Have you tried making a list of what's bothering you?" he suggested once. That only made her feel further apart from him. Gradually, she began missing something she couldn't quite define. It wasn't just desire or passion. It was that electric feeling that made your heart race. That sense that something new could happen at any moment. She started noticing couples on the street, laughing, arguing, hugging tightly, and found herself wondering if she'd accepted a life that was too safe, so safe it had become empty. She remembered her mother saying love doesn't fill your stomach, but now she wondered, when your stomach is full, what fills the rest? The emptiness inside her grew quietly. In front of others, Paige still played the perfect wife. She posted photos smiling next to Miles at carefully planned dinners, celebrating birthdays with standardized cakes and greeting card quotes. But inside, she felt like an actress who'd forgotten her real lines and was just reciting memorized ones. The feeling of being trapped didn't come from yelling, it came from too much calm. It wasn't a lack of affection, it was too much predictability. One night, while washing dinner dishes, she looked over at Miles sitting in the living room and thought, this is the life I chose. But did this life ever choose me back? That question stuck with her like an invisible itch. She started daydreaming about unlikely scenarios, random encounters, conversations that surprised her. And when she snapped back to reality, she returned to being Miles's wife, but each time with less enthusiasm. Her marriage kept running like clockwork, and precisely because of that, she no longer felt like part of it. Everything turned smoothly, but without soul. It was as if she'd stepped into a story her mother wrote, but one she'd never actually authored herself. And that thought haunted her every time she laid her head on the pillow. Paige left the house that day with no intention of changing her life. She just needed to buy some basic things, restock what was missing. It was a routine trip to the market, the kind you make almost on autopilot. As she pushed her cart down the aisles, she mentally checked off her list like always. At one point, while reaching for a high shelf, one of the bags she was carrying slipped and spilled items onto the floor. Before she could bend down, someone else was already picking them up. When she looked, her eyes met a stranger's, who handed her one of the items with a small, effortless smile, as if helping was just part of his routine. His name was Dylan. He wore jeans and a plain t-shirt, but there was something about the way he spoke that caught her attention. He didn't seem in a rush, and he didn't just hand back the bag and leave. He made a casual comment about how unstable the shopping carts at that store were, and Paige laughed, not because it was funny, but out of politeness. Still, that laugh felt different from the forced ones she often gave during conversations with Miles. Dylan didn't seem to measure his words. He talked like time was stretchy and there was space for any topic, no matter how pointless. When she said goodbye, he asked if she lived nearby. Without thinking too much, she said yes. In the following days, she kept running into Dylan. The first time might have been coincidence. The second, maybe two. But the third time felt like fate testing her. He was sitting at the corner cafe, scrolling on his phone. When he saw her, he waved like they were old friends. She hesitated, but sat down anyway. Coffee turned into conversation, and the talk drifted into unexpected topics. Dylan talked about music, travel, childhood memories. He asked curious questions. And most strikingly, he listened like he genuinely wanted to understand. Before she knew it, they were laughing together about things she hadn't realized she still enjoyed. That conversation opened something inside her. For days, Paige replayed every detail of their meeting. She returned to the cafe once, twice, 3 times. And Dylan was always around. When she mentioned she liked old movies, he showed up the next day with a DVD of a classic she'd brought up. Said it was a borrowed gift. And when she hesitated, he replied he just wanted an excuse to see her again. Paige felt her heart beat differently. How long had it been since anyone cared about the movies she liked? Their connection grew fast, like there was urgency in every exchange. Random texts started arriving on her phone throughout the day. Dylan sent jokes, photos of things he saw on the street, songs with lyrics he thought matched her. Slowly, Paige found herself smiling at her phone in the middle of work. She started leaving the house more carefully, choosing clothes that made her feel beautiful. She began seeing herself differently. She felt desired, seen, remembered. And that pushed her further and further away from the role she played at home. The first touch was light, a brush of fingers when he handed her coffee. Then, a quick kiss when they said goodbye, like it had been waiting since their first meeting. Neither of them talked about boundaries. They just kept giving in, day after day, as if the real world was just a thin curtain, easy to step through. Paige lied to Miles, saying she'd be having dinner with a friend. She had dinner with Dylan. Afterward, a short walk turned into stopping at a hotel parking lot. And from that moment on, there was no more room for doubt, she had crossed the line. The feeling after her first intimate moment with Dylan was complicated. There was excitement, guilt, euphoria, shame, and a strange sense of relief, like collapsing after carrying something too heavy for too long. But instead of stopping, she clung to it. Her excuse was always the same: with Dylan, she felt alive. He noticed things Miles never did. He reacted to her ideas with real enthusiasm. He talked about living in the moment, taking risks, not wasting time trying to control everything. And Paige surrendered to that idea like someone who'd spent a lifetime struggling to breathe underwater. The lies became routine. She started scheduling her meetings with Dylan at times when Miles would never suspect. Sometimes she said she was going to the gym. Other times, attending a workshop. She made up stories with surprising ease. And the more she pulled away from her life with Miles, the more she felt this new version of herself was truer. Dylan came to represent everything she'd been missing: impulse, desire, freedom, mistakes, risk. And his presence became addictive, an instant relief from everything she felt was missing in her marriage. The strangest part was that, even as she fell deeper, Paige never considered leaving Miles. She wanted Dylan, but she wanted to keep her life with Miles intact. It was like living two parallel lives and believing she could maintain both. She thought she deserved this burst of novelty after years of being the organized, controlled, stable wife. It was as if Dylan were a secret reward for following the rules for so long. She didn't realize each lie pulled another, that every justification cost something deeper. As her meetings with Dylan became more frequent, the distance between her and Miles grew stronger. But Paige no longer felt guilty. She convinced herself she was just following where life led. That the world was made of crooked paths. That love, maybe, was just something that split. And so, the woman who once swore she only wanted stability now lived hidden behind desires slipping through her fingers. And the deeper she got, the farther she moved from who she used to be. Miles had already put together enough pieces to stop pretending he didn't see what was right in front of him. After weeks of watching Paige slowly drift away, hearing the same excuses, noticing unexplained absences, he decided to end the uncertainty. He discreetly installed cameras around the house, in strategic spots. Not because he wanted to spy, but because deep down, he already knew what he'd find. And he did. On the third day of recordings, there she was, walking in with Dylan through the front door like it was normal. Talking, laughing, kissing. Then disappearing into the bedroom. Miles watched it all in silence. He didn't shed a single tear. He just stared, as if trying to absorb every detail before making the decision he'd already made. He waited until she came back from yet another dinner with a friend. As soon as she walked in, he was in the living room with his laptop open. Paige was surprised to see him there. Miles asked her to sit down. His tone was calm, completely steady. When she asked what was going on, he simply turned the screen toward her. The video started playing. It took her a few seconds to process. First her eyes widened, then she tried to stammer out an explanation. Miles stayed frozen, watching her reactions without blinking. When the video ended, he closed the laptop with one sharp motion. He told her the marriage was over right there. That there was no room for justifications, let alone promises to change. He explained firmly that the house they lived in had belonged to him long before the wedding, and she knew that. He asked her to pack her things and leave. He said he didn't want to live beside someone who had silently destroyed everything. Paige tried to hold back emotion. She cried, begged for forgiveness, reached out to touch his arm. She asked if they could talk, explain, rebuild. Miles refused everything. He said respect is something that, once broken, can't be fixed. It just vanishes. And she had lost it. As she went upstairs to pack, Miles picked up his phone and sent the video to her parents. No caption, no message, just the file. Since the wedding, he'd been sending them a monthly amount to help keep their small family business running, and he knew they relied on that money to survive. It was part of a quiet support system he'd offered out of kindness. But that was over now. Minutes later, as Paige zipped up her last suitcase, her phone started vibrating. Her mom. Then her dad. Then her mom again. She ignored it for a few seconds, but she already knew what was coming. She left the house with puffy eyes, dragging a suitcase and carrying a bag over her shoulder. Miles just opened the door and stepped aside. He didn't say a word. The moment she turned the corner, he deleted her from his phone. On the other side of town, her parents were already waiting, voices raised. Her father, who'd always seen Miles as the perfect son-in-law, was shouting from the garage before she even stepped inside. He called her ungrateful, a disgrace to the family. Her mom, crying, demanded answers, saying they were suffering because of a choice they didn't even understand. Paige tried to explain, sobbing, saying it all spiraled out of control, that she'd lost herself. Her father wouldn't hear it. He said if she wanted to live like an adult, then she could support herself like one. From that moment on, she'd have to figure out her life alone. That night, locked in her old teenage bedroom, surrounded by outdated furniture and memories that no longer meant anything, Paige finally grasped the depth of the abyss she'd created with her own hands. She hadn't just lost a husband, she'd lost her family's respect, their support, her stability. And none of the messages she sent afterward were answered. Not by Miles. Not by her parents. She fell asleep curled up, hugging her guilt, surrounded by the echo of everything she'd thrown away. And for the first time since it all began, she knew with absolute clarity that the consequences were only just beginning. Paige started living in her parents' old guest room like someone dragged back to a place she'd never missed. It was as if the past had grabbed her by the hair and shoved her back to where it all started, but this time with no protection. The twin bed creaked with every move, the walls carried memories that brought no comfort, and her parents' stares, those were the hardest to face. Her father didn't even greet her the day she arrived with suitcases. He just watched her cross the living room like he was witnessing the collapse of a structure he'd helped build. Her mom tried to say something, but held back. There was an air of shame everywhere, like the house itself disapproved of its daughter. On her first morning, Paige couldn't get out of bed. She pretended to sleep to avoid talking. She heard her parents moving around, silverware clinking during breakfast prep, and lay there under the covers, wishing she could disappear. Her phone buzzed a few times, messages from people she knew. Some offering awkward support, others asking what really happened. A few clearly just wanted gossip. Dylan didn't send a single message. No missed calls, no voice notes. And that hurt more than her parents' reaction. The man who whispered promises in her ear, who told her she deserved more, vanished the moment reality demanded payment for the fantasy. In the days that followed, Paige realized she now had to fight for basic things. The privileges she'd had in her marriage, new clothes, ready-made dinners, paid apps, Saturday massages, disappeared as quickly as the respect of everyone around her. She needed a job. Any job. She went to a stationery store downtown, then 2 clothing shops, a small grocery. She handed out resumes everywhere. In some places, she wasn't even properly greeted. In others, she heard uncomfortable comments, "You're that girl, right? The one who lived with the engineer." Each sentence was a knife pushing her deeper into reality. A week later, she landed a job as a clerk at a small household goods store. The pay was low, the owner was strict, and time dragged endlessly. But she needed it, needed the bare minimum so she wouldn't depend on her parents. Her mom still helped with some meals, but her father barely spoke. He walked around with a permanent frown. One particularly tense day, she overheard him tell her mom, loud enough for her to hear, "That girl destroyed everything. And now she comes back here to sleep like she's the victim." Paige's stomach twisted, but she didn't respond. She swallowed the humiliation, just like she'd been doing with everything. It was then that Monica appeared, Miles's sister. She showed up unexpectedly late in the afternoon, just as the store was nearly empty. She was a nurse and always carried that look of someone who sees everything without needing to ask. Monica walked in without hesitation, picked up some random item, and headed to the counter. Paige froze for a second. Her throat went dry. Monica didn't show anger or contempt. She just looked her in the eyes and said, "He forgave you." Paige took a moment to understand what that meant. Monica continued, "What you did hurt. But Miles chose to move on. He won't come looking for you. He won't carry hate toward you. He just moved forward." Those words, as gentle as they sounded, hit harder than any scream. Paige broke down inside. Until then, she'd thought Miles's silence was a strategy, that maybe he was still processing everything, that there might still be a chance to talk someday. But what Monica brought was something else. It was finality. There was no room for reconciliation. No invitation to rebuild. Just closure. And it came with dignity. He chose to forgive, not because he still loved her, but because he didn't want to carry any piece of her anymore. Paige tried to keep it together until the end of her shift, but her hands shook and her voice cracked. After Monica left, she sat in the back of the store and cried silently. She realized the real punishment wasn't her father's yelling or Dylan's indifference. It was Miles's maturity. The way he chose to let her go without needing to hurt her back. It was like being cut through by a blade made of respect. A few weeks later, on her way home from work, she found an envelope on her bed. No return address, no name, just his handwriting, firm and steady. It was a letter. Paige held it for minutes before finding the courage to open it. The first sentence hit her like a punch. Miles wrote like someone who'd already moved beyond everything. He said he didn't want to judge her, that everyone lives according to the ghosts they carry, and that he'd known from the start she feared poverty, feared becoming her mother. He said he understood she wasn't looking for love, but protection. And even so, he chose to stay, trying to build something on unstable ground. The hardest part came at the end. He admitted he'd known, even before marriage, that she'd never loved him the way he loved her. He'd noticed it in the details, the cold touch, the lack of curiosity, the robotic responses. But he believed that over time, she might learn to love. That maybe stability could awaken something genuine in her. Miles acknowledged in that letter that his mistake was underestimating the weight of an empty heart. He said he didn't blame her, but he no longer felt anything except gratitude, for having learned from it all. The letter ended with, "Thank you for showing me that loving someone also means letting them go before they destroy themselves trying to save you." Paige sat for hours, holding that piece of paper like it weighed 1,000 pounds. She had destroyed the man who treated her with more respect than she ever thought she deserved. And now, even after everything, he was the one delivering the final word, and it was forgiveness. It was the definitive end. And all that remained of her in that moment was the reflection of someone who mistook love for comfort. Who traded stability for adventure, not realizing that not every risk is worth the price it demands later. And for the first time since it all began, she dared to look at herself without looking away, because there was no one else left to fool. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.